The village of Rosehill lay beneath a pale September sun that seemed determined to prolong summer by sheer good manners. The roses climbing the old brick walls still held their blooms, though a few leaves had begun to bronze at the edges, and the air carried that faint chill which reminded sensible people to bring cardigans even when the morning appeared cheerful. In the garden behind the parish hall, trestle tables had been arranged with military precision beneath striped awnings. White cloths fluttered gently in the breeze. Plates of seed cake, bath buns, sponge sandwiches, and little cucumber triangles stood in careful ranks beside polished silver teapots. A handwritten sign reading Rose Hill Autumn Benefit Tea leaned slightly crooked beside a basket of dahlias. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Elspeth Greeley, stood surveying the arrangements with a look of restrained martyrdom. "I said plainly," she announced to no one in particular, "that the jam tarts were to be placed near the raffle table. One loses all sense of order otherwise." Nobody replied. The women bustling about the lawn had long since discovered that agreement merely encouraged Mrs. Greeley. At a small wrought-iron table near the hedge sat Miss Jane Marple, knitting with soft concentration. Her pale blue eyes moved occasionally from her needles to the assembled villagers, though no one observing her would have guessed how very little escaped her attention. Beside her, Miss Lavinia, Trent poured tea. "You should have entered your preserves again this year, Miss Marple," she said. "Everyone still talks about the apricot chutney." "Oh, dear," said Miss Marple modestly. "That was really only because poor me sighs. Finch had influenza at the time. Under ordinary circumstances she always wins." Trent lowered her voice. "Have you seen who's come back to Rose Hill?" Miss Marple looked mildly interested. "My dear, people are always coming back to villages. One notices it particularly after funerals." Miss Trent leaned closer. "Cecily Harrow." Miss Marple's knitting paused for just a fraction. "Indeed? She arrived last week, staying at Harrow House." "How very interesting," murmured Miss Marple. The name still carried a curious force in Rose Hill, though nearly 20 years had passed. Cecily Harrow had once been the village beauty, brilliant, reckless, admired by men and disliked by women with an intensity they generally disguised as moral concern. Then, quite suddenly, she had vanished to London after her father's death. Rumours had followed in her wake. Debts, unsuitable companions, some unfortunate affair involving a married man. Villagers preserved such stories with astonishing care. Now she had returned. Miss Marple glanced discreetly across the lawn. Cecily Harrow stood near the raffle table speaking to Colonel Avery. She was a handsome woman still, though beauty had sharpened into something harder. Her silver-grey suit was perfectly cut, her hat elegant without appearing to try. Yet there was tension in her posture, as though she expected attack even during polite conversation. Several villagers watched her while pretending not to. "That poor woman," said Miss Marple softly. Miss Trent blinked. "Poor? My dear Miss Marple, most people would say she has behaved abominably all her life." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "That is often why one feels sorry for them." Before Miss Trent could reply, a burst of laughter erupted near the tea-urns. Mr. Leonard Pike, solicitor and chairman of nearly every committee in Rose Hill, was entertaining a cluster of guests with one of his tiresome anecdotes. "And naturally," he boomed. The fellow insisted the dog had eaten the document. Extraordinary what people expect a solicitor to believe. Polite laughter followed. Mr. Pike was a large, florid man whose geniality possessed a curious bullying quality. He liked influence, committees, and hearing himself referred to as a pillar of the community. His wife, a nervous woman with tired eyes, hovered nearby arranging teaspoons. Miss Marple observed them thoughtfully. At 3:30 the fete was proceeding with satisfactory smoothness. The raffle had sold briskly. The church choir had sung somewhat uncertainly but with conviction, and several elderly gentlemen were already discussing whether rain might come by evening despite a cloudless sky. Then the screaming began. It came from inside the parish hall. Every head turned. A young maid from Harrow House stumbled through the doorway, white-faced and trembling violently. Oh, God, someone come quickly." Mrs. Greeley hurried forward. "What is this disturbance?" "The study-room," gasped the girl. "Mr. Pike, he's fallen." Chairs scraped violently across the lawn. People surged toward the hall in confused alarm. Miss Marple rose more slowly than the others. Inside the little committee room beyond the corridor smelled sharply of tea and something else beneath it, something metallic. Mr. Leonard Pike sat collapsed sideways in a wooden chair beside the tea tray prepared for committee members. One arm hung grotesquely limp. His face had taken on a dreadful greyish colour, and his eyes stared upward with shocked incomprehension. A teacup lay shattered on the carpet beside him. "Mrs." Pike gave a thin animal cry. Dr. Haydock, the village physician, pushed forward briskly. "Stand back, please. Give him air." The room fell into terrified silence while the doctor bent over the body. After a moment he straightened slowly. "I'm afraid Mr. Pike is dead." The words seemed to settle over the room like cold ash. "No." Dr. Haydock's expression had altered. He leaned closer to the table, examining the tea service. Then he looked up sharply. "Has anyone touched anything?" There was murmuring. "No." "I don't think so." The doctor picked up the remaining teacup carefully with a handkerchief. "Send for the police immediately." Mrs. Greeley stared. "You don't mean?" Dr. Haydock's voice was grave. "I believe Mr. Pike may have been poisoned." The effect was instantaneous. The villagers recoiled from one another almost physically. Faces changed. Eyes widened with fear and fascination. Poison. There was something peculiarly dreadful about poison in an English village. It suggested intimacy, deliberation, civilized malice concealed beneath ordinary domestic life. Miss Marple's gaze drifted quietly about the room. The tray held a silver teapot, a milk jug, sugar bowl, and 3 cups. One remained untouched. Another sat half empty beside a chair. The third, broken on the carpet, had apparently fallen from Mr. Pike's hand at death. And then there was the 4th cup. It stood near the edge of the tray, a pale green porcelain cup with painted violets, without a handle. Miss Marple's eyes rested on it for a long moment. "How odd," she murmured almost to herself. Inspector Daniel Graves arrived from Medchester before 5 o'clock. He was a broad-shouldered man with competent features and an air of practical impatience. Villagers irritated him slightly. They concealed malice beneath excessive politeness. The body had already been removed upstairs. Inspector Graves questioned witnesses in the hall while constables kept anxious villagers at bay. "You're certain no outsider entered the room?" he asked. Mrs. Greeley dabbed her eyes. "No one unusual. Only committee members." "And who prepared the tea?" A pause followed. The young maid, Edith Bell, raised a trembling hand. "I carried the tray from the kitchen, sir." "And after that?" "I left it in the committee room." "Who entered afterward?" Names emerged uncertainly. Mr. Pike himself, Mrs. Pike, Avery briefly, possibly Miss Harrow. At that, murmurs spread instantly. Inspector Graves noticed. "Miss Harrow." Cecily stood near the doorway, perfectly composed though rather pale. "I went in for perhaps 30 seconds, she said coolly. "Mr. Pike wished to speak with me privately." "What about?" "That is no concern of yours. It may become one." Their eyes met. Finally she said, "A property matter." Inspector Graves wrote something in his notebook. Miss Marple sat quietly in the corner of the hall, knitting again. Dr. Haydock approached her. "You look thoughtful." "My dear doctor," said Miss Marple gently, "villages are very curious places. People imagine they are peaceful because everything happens quietly. You think this was planned?" "Oh, yes." The doctor lowered his voice. "You noticed something?" Miss Marple glanced toward the committee room. "That teacup without the handle." Dr. Haydock blinked. "The green one?" "Yes." "It struck me because old Mrs. Simcox used to own a set exactly like it. One cup lost its handle after a terrible quarrel with the charwoman in 1931. She kept using it nevertheless because she disliked waste." The doctor looked puzzled. "I fail to see." "Human beings," said Miss Marple softly, "become attached to peculiar habits. One notices such things. Outside, dusk had begun settling over Rose Hill. The fair table stood abandoned beneath the fading light, half-eaten cakes still resting on plates beside overturned chairs. The ordinary world had been interrupted, and somewhere among the frightened villagers moving home through quiet lanes, someone already knew precisely how Leonard Pike had died. By the following morning, Rose Hill had divided itself neatly into 3 categories: those who claimed they had always distrusted Leonard Pike, those who insisted such a thing could never have happened in a respectable village, and those who secretly enjoyed the excitement while pretending to deplore it. Miss Marple, who understood villages extremely well, knew that all 3 groups often contained the very same people. The news had spread with astonishing efficiency. Before breakfast trays were cleared, Medchester already knew of the poisoning. By 10 o'clock, 2 reporters had appeared outside the Blue Boar Inn pretending to inquire about bus schedules. The village itself wore an altered expression. Curtains twitched more than usual. Conversation stopped abruptly when footsteps approached. Even the grocer's assistant, usually incapable of silence, wrapped parcels with solemn discretion. Miss Marple sat near the window of her cottage parlour, arranging late chrysanthemums into a small blue vase when her maid, Florence, entered carrying the Morning Post. "They're all talking about it down at Wilson's," Florence announced eagerly. "Mrs. Price says it must have been that Harrow woman." Miss Marple selected another flower thoughtfully. "Mrs. Price generally says whatever is most dramatic." "Well, people don't forget things, miss." "No," said Miss Marple quietly. "They very rarely do." Among the letters lay a note from Dolly Bantry of St. Mary Mead, written in sprawling, affectionate handwriting. "My dear Jane, I hear you have acquired a murder at last. One almost envies you, though perhaps one shouldn't. Arthur says poison is always unpleasant. Do tell me everything immediately." Miss Marple smiled faintly and laid the letter aside. A murder, she reflected, was rather like dropping ink into clean water. The stain spread outward through every relationship, every old grievance and hidden anxiety, until the entire village darkened with suspicion. At 11:30, Inspector Graves called at the cottage. Florence admitted him with visible excitement. "The inspector to see you, miss." Miss Marple rose politely. "How nice of you to come." Inspector Graves removed his hat. "I'm told you were present yesterday." "Yes, indeed. Such a dreadful thing." He accepted the offered chair with slight hesitation. Men like Inspector Graves often underestimated elderly women until experience taught them caution. "You noticed anything unusual?" Miss Marple considered. "Many things are unusual when examined properly." The inspector suppressed impatience. "Specifically?" "Well," said Miss Marple, "people were rather interested in Miss Harrow." "Why?" "Oh, dear, surely you know village history already." "I prefer facts." Miss Marple nodded approvingly. "Very sensible, though facts without human nature can be quite misleading." Inspector Graves took out his notebook. "What do you know about Leonard Pike?" "A hard-working man," said Miss Marple mildly. "Very ambitious, fond of influence. That's not exactly criminal. But ambitious men often collect resentments without noticing." The inspector leaned forward. "Did Pike have enemies?" "My dear Inspector, every solicitor has enemies, particularly in villages." She folded her hands. "There was the boundary dispute with Colonel Avery 2 years ago. Mrs. Finch believed he manipulated her sister's will. Young Gerald Foster lost nearly all his inheritance after some unfortunate investment Mr. Pike recommended. And of course there was Miss Harrow." At the last name, Inspector Graves looked up sharply. "Yes, about that." Miss Marple's expression remained innocent. She and Pike disliked one another very much. "Why?" "That," said Miss Marple, "is exactly what people are wondering." Before the inspector could continue, the garden gate clicked outside. A moment later, Dr. Haydock entered briskly, carrying his medical bag. "Ah!" "Doctor?" Haydock nodded to Miss Marple. "I've just come from the laboratory report." Inspector Graves straightened instantly. "Well?" Silence settled over the room. "Quite a substantial amount," the doctor continued. "It was definitely in the tea." Inspector Graves frowned. "1 cup specifically?" "That's the interesting part. The poison appears concentrated in the broken cup the one Pike drank from." "Meaning the entire pot wasn't poisoned?" "Apparently not." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused gently. "How very deliberate," she murmured. Inspector Graves closed his notebook with satisfaction. "That simplifies matters considerably." "Does it?" asked Miss Marple. He looked at her. The poison was targeted. Someone prepared Pike's cup individually. According to witness statements, Miss Harrow was alone in the room with him shortly before death. Dr. Haydock shifted uneasily. "That's still circumstantial. It's sufficient to begin with." After the inspector departed, the doctor lingered by the fireplace. "You don't agree with him?" Miss Marple resumed knitting. "Inspector Graves is quite intelligent, but policemen sometimes prefer solutions that arrive quickly and look tidy. You think Cecily Harrow innocent?" "I think," said Miss Marple carefully, "that people who commit murder by poison usually possess either extreme coldness or extreme fear. Miss Harrow has neither temperament." The doctor looked surprised. "She's certainly capable of unpleasantness." "Oh, yes." "But unpleasant women are not necessarily murderous. In fact, genuinely dangerous people are often much easier company." Dr. Haydock laughed despite himself. "That's an alarming observation. My dear doctor, villages teach one such things." That afternoon Rose Hill's gossip reached full maturity. At the Blue Boar Inn, Mrs. Ellison declared loudly that Cecily Harrow had once tried to run away with a pianist. By the butcher's shop, someone confidently asserted Leonard Pike had been blackmailing half the county. At the post office, Miss Trent whispered that poison was the sort of thing passionate women resorted to. Meanwhile, at Harrow House, Cecily Harrow sat alone in the morning room staring at untouched coffee. The old house seemed too large for one person. Dusty portraits watched from dark-paneled walls. The curtains smelled faintly of lavender and neglect. Her maid announced a visitor. "Miss Marple, madame." Cecily looked genuinely startled. "Show her in." Miss Marple entered with gentle composure. "How kind of you to receive me. You've come to investigate me, too?" "My dear," said Miss Marple, settling carefully into a chair, "old women investigate everybody. It is our chief amusement." Against her will, Cecily smiled faintly. "You're honest, at least." There was a brief silence. Then Miss Marple said quietly, "You were afraid yesterday." Cecily's expression hardened instantly. "Anyone would be." "No," said Miss Marple, "not in that way." The younger woman turned toward the window. Outside, late sunlight touched the neglected gardens where roses tangled wildly across cracked stone paths. "He hated me," Cecily said abruptly. "Mr. Pike?" "Why?" For several moments Cecily did not answer. Finally she said, "Because my father trusted him." Miss Marple waited patiently. "When father died," Cecily continued, "Pike handled everything. Estates, investments, legal affairs. I was foolish then. I signed papers without reading them. And later? I discovered Harrow House should never have been nearly bankrupt." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened slightly. "You believe money was stolen?" "I know it was." "Can you prove it?" A bitter smile touched Cecily's mouth. "Apparently not." Miss Marple studied her quietly. "Did you confront him yesterday?" "What happened?" He laughed. For the first time, genuine emotion broke through Cecily's composure. "He said no one in Rose Hill would ever believe me. He said people always prefer respectable men to difficult women." Miss Marple sighed softly. "That is often true." Cecily turned suddenly. "You think I killed him?" "No." The answer came so simply that Cecily stared. "Why not?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "Because if you had poisoned Leonard Pike, my dear, you would not have chosen a crowded fete. You possess far too much pride." For several seconds neither spoke. Then Cecily laughed unexpectedly, a short, almost broken sound. "You are extraordinary." "Oh, no," said Miss Marple. "Merely observant." As she prepared to leave, her gaze drifted briefly toward a cabinet near the fireplace. Inside stood a porcelain tea-service painted with violets. One cup had no handle. Miss Marple paused. "How charming," she said lightly. "Such pretty china." Cecily glanced over. "It belonged to my mother." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "I thought perhaps it had." Outside Harrow House, the autumn air carried the faint scent of wood smoke. Miss Marple walked slowly back toward the village. Something troubled her deeply now, not the poisoning itself, but the curious matter of the broken teacup and its twin sitting quietly in Cecily Harrow's cabinet. Two identical cups, one at Harrow House, one at the parish hall. And somewhere between them lay the truth. Rain arrived during the night and settled over Rose Hill with determined persistence. By morning the village lanes glistened darkly beneath dripping hedgerows, and the church bells sounded muffled in the damp air. Miss Marple approved of rain for certain purposes. It kept people indoors long enough to gossip properly. She spent the morning at the Blue Boar Tea Room, where Mrs. Cartwright served weak coffee, excellent scones, and information in reckless abundance. Today the room hummed with speculation. "They say Inspector Graves has practically finished the case," announced Mrs. Ellison from behind a plate of currant buns. "Men always arrest the wrong person first." Currant buns. "Men always arrest the wrong person first," declared old Mr. Pritchard gloomily. "Nonsense," said Mrs. Finch. "That Harrow woman admitted quarreling with him." "A quarrel is not murder. It often leads to it," Mrs. Ellison observed darkly. Miss Marple sat quietly beside the window stirring tea she had no intention of drinking. Beside her, Miss Lavinia. Trent lowered her voice confidentially. "There's another story now." "Indeed?" "About Leonard Pike and money." Miss Marple looked interested but unsurprised. "There usually is after solicitors die." Miss Trent leaned closer. "My cousin's husband works at the Medchester Bank. Apparently Pike invested funds for several village families. Some people lost quite a lot." "How unfortunate." "And do you know," Miss Trent continued eagerly, "young Gerald Foster threatened him publicly last spring." Miss Marple remembered Gerald Foster very well. a handsome young man with restless charm and perpetual financial difficulty. Villages produced such men regularly. Women trusted them against all reason, while older men disapproved of them with exhausting consistency. What was the quarrel about, she asked. Oh, investments or shares or something dreadful. Gerald said Pike had ruined him. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Financial desperation, resentment, public humiliation, perfectly reasonable motives for murder, and therefore, she reflected, possibly irrelevant. At noon she walked slowly through the rain toward the vicarage. Near the post office she encountered Colonel Avery emerging from his motor car with visible irritation. Beastly weather. Yes, indeed, said Miss Marple pleasantly. The colonel hesitated. You've heard Graves intends to arrest Cecily Harrow? Has he decided that already? Seems obvious enough. Miss Marple regarded him mildly. Does it? Colonel Avery frowned. My dear lady, she had motive, opportunity, and one of those damned poisonous personalities. Miss Marple gave a small apologetic smile. Men are often very suspicious of difficult women, Colonel. It reminds me rather of poor Mrs. Dalrymple in St. Mary Mead. Everyone believes she poisoned her husband because she corrected his grammar at dinner. And hadn't she? Oh, yes, said Miss Marple calmly. But not fatally. The colonel looked uncertain whether he was being mocked. As he drove away, Miss Marple continued thoughtfully toward the vicarage. Colonel Avery disliked Cecily Harrow with unusual force. That, too, was interesting. Inside the vicarage drawing-room, Mrs. Greeley sat surrounded by lists, unpaid invoices, and emotional exhaustion. This tragedy has completely ruined the parish accounts, she declared immediately. No one thinks of practical matters during a murder. Miss Marple accepted tea. How is Mrs. Pike? Oh, dreadful. Sedated constantly. Mrs. Greeley lowered her voice. Though between ourselves, she doesn't seem entirely surprised. Miss Marple's eyes lifted gently. No? Well? Greeley hesitated, delighted by her own reluctance. There were stories. What sort of stories? About Leonard and other women. There it was. Miss Marple had been expecting it. In villages, murder rarely remained alone for long. It attracted old scandals the way damp weather attracted rheumatism. Did Mrs. Pike know? My dear Miss Marple, wives always know. Mrs. Greeley stirred her tea violently. One cannot help pitying her. Such a quiet woman. And he could be very overbearing. Miss Marple nodded absently. Quiet women. People overlook them astonishingly often. After leaving the vicarage, she paid a small call upon Mrs. Pike herself. The solicitor's house stood near the village green, red-bricked and respectable, with carefully clipped hedges that suggested Leonard Pike's personality exactly. Inside, however, the atmosphere felt curiously airless, as though years of unhappiness had settled into the wallpaper. Mrs. Pike received her in a darkened sitting-room. She appeared smaller now, diminished somehow. Her pale hands twisted continually in her lap. "How kind of you to come, my dear Mrs. Pike." There was silence. Then suddenly Mrs. Pike whispered, "They're saying terrible things." Miss Marple waited. "About Leonard, about Miss Harrow." Her voice trembled. "But people never understand marriages." "No," said Miss Marple softly. "Very rarely." Mrs. Pike stared at the fire. "He wasn't cruel exactly." The word exactly lingered in the room. He simply liked controlling people. Small things at first. Money. Decisions. Friendships. She gave a weak smile. After many years one scarcely notices. Miss Marple observed her carefully. A woman worn thin by habit. "How long had you known Miss Harrow?" she asked gently. Mrs. Pike looked startled. "Oh, before she left Rose Hill." "Were you friends?" A strange expression crossed Mrs. Pike's face. No woman in Rose Hill was ever really friends with Cecily Harrow. That, Miss Marple suspected, was perfectly true. As she prepared to leave, her eyes drifted across the room. On a side table rested a tray containing untouched condolence letters. Beside them stood a china teacup painted with violets, without a handle. Miss Marple stopped very still. Mrs. Pike noticed her gaze. "Oh," she said faintly. "Leonard hated that cup." "Did he?" "He said it looked shabby." Miss Marple moved closer. "How curious. It belonged to Cecily's mother originally," Mrs. Pike explained. "Years ago, when the Harrows sold furnishings after the old scandal, Leonard bought several pieces cheaply. The tea set was among them." Miss Marple's mind sharpened instantly. "Several pieces?" "Yeah. There were originally 6 cups, I believe." Miss Marple smiled gently. "How very interesting." Outside, rain continued falling softly over Rose Hill. But now the little green cup had altered entirely in meaning. Not unique. part of a set, and therefore easy to duplicate. That evening Inspector Graves finally acted. The news spread before supper. Cecily Harrow had been formally arrested for the murder of Leonard Pike. By 8 o'clock, nearly every villager considered the matter solved. She threatened him publicly. She had every reason. Poison's a woman's crime. Miss Marple disliked that last phrase intensely. Men said it with such satisfaction. Near 9 o'clock, Dr. Haydock arrived at her cottage soaked from the rain and visibly annoyed. "This is moving far too quickly." Miss Marple poured tea. The inspector found arsenic in a cosmetic powder case at Harrow House. "How convenient," murmured Miss Marple. Haydock looked sharply at her. "You don't believe it? My dear doctor, evidence is rather like blackberry jam stains. The more obvious they are, the more carefully one ought to examine them." He sat heavily. "Then who did it?" Miss Marple added sugar thoughtfully. "I'm not yet certain, but you suspect someone." Miss Marple looked into the fire for a long moment. Someone very accustomed to being overlooked. The doctor frowned. Before he could ask further, there came a sudden knock at the cottage door. Florence admitted the visitor with wide eyes. It was Edith Bell, the maid from Harrow House. The girl looked terrified. "Please, Miss Marple," she whispered. "I didn't know where else to go." Miss Marple rose immediately. "What is it, child?" Edith wrung her hands desperately. "It's about the teacups." A silence fell. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Then the girl whispered, "I think someone changed them after Mr. Pike died." Edith Bell sat trembling in Miss Marple's small parlor, while Florence hovered anxiously near the doorway, pretending to straighten cushions. Outside, rain streaked the cottage windows in wavering silver lines, and the fire gave off a steady warmth that only gradually calmed the frightened girl. Miss Marple handed her a cup of tea. "Now then, my dear, sip that slowly and tell us exactly what troubles you." Edith obeyed with shaking hands. "I shouldn't have come," she whispered. "If the police hear—" "The police," said Miss Marple gently, "prefer facts to fear. Unfortunately, frightened people often forget facts unless someone listens kindly." The girl swallowed hard. "It's the cups, miss. I laid out the tea tray myself before the fete committee meeting. 4 cups. The green one without the handle was there because Mrs. Pike always used it for extra trays." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened slightly. "Always?" "Yes, miss. She said there was no sense wasting good china over a broken handle." Very sensible village reasoning, thought Miss Marple. "And afterward?" Edith twisted her fingers together. "When everyone rushed in after Mr. Pike collapsed, I was frightened and stayed near the door. But while Dr. Haydock was bending over him, I saw someone touch the tray." The girl hesitated miserably. "I'm not certain. Try." It happened quickly. Someone moved beside the table and the cups rattled. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Did you see a hand? A man's hand or woman's?" "I think—" Edith shut her eyes tightly. "A woman's, miss. Wearing gloves." Dr. Haydock frowned. "Why didn't you tell Inspector Graves?" The girl looked near tears. "Because afterward everyone kept saying Miss Harrow must have done it. And then they arrested her, and I thought perhaps I'd imagined it." Miss Marple patted her hand gently. "You observed something important." The doctor looked troubled. "If the cups were moved after death, the evidence chain becomes uncertain." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "Very uncertain indeed." After Edith departed, escorted home by Florence and a large umbrella, Dr. Haydock remained staring into the fire. "You think someone switched the poisoned cup?" "Possibly. But why?" Miss Marple resumed knitting. "To direct suspicion." The doctor considered. "If Pike's cup originally differed from the others—" "Yes?" "Then replacing it with the distinctive green cup would attract attention." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Exactly. And since the matching set belonged originally to the Harrows—" "The implication becomes delightfully obvious," said Miss Marple. Haydock shook his head. "Good Lord!" There was a silence. Then Miss Marple said quietly, "The difficulty with planned murders is that they require performance afterward, and performances often contain tiny mistakes." The following morning dawned gray but dry. Rosehill seemed oddly subdued now that an arrest had been made. People could gossip more comfortably once danger appeared contained. At the butcher's shop, Mrs. Ellison announced triumphantly that she had known from the beginning Cecily Harrow possessed a criminal temperament. Near the church gate, 2 elderly sisters discussed poison with breathless enjoyment. "At least it wasn't an axe." "No, indeed. Axes are common." Miss Marple found such distinctions peculiarly English. She spent the morning visiting Harrow House. The maid admitted her reluctantly. "I'm afraid Miss Harrow cannot receive visitors. Please tell her it is Miss Marple." A few minutes later, Cecily herself appeared at the top of the staircase. She looked exhausted but perfectly controlled. "You're very persistent." "My dear," said Miss Marple gently, "old women have little else to do." Cecily gave the faintest smile and led her into the morning-room. "You've heard? The inspector believes he's solved everything." Miss Marple glanced toward the cabinet containing the violet-patterned china. "How many cups originally belonged to that set?" Cecily blinked. "6, I think. And now? 3 remain here. 1 was broken years ago. Leonard Pike bought 2 when father sold furnishings." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Did you ever notice whether Mrs. Pike used the handleless cup regularly?" "Yes," said Cecily, surprised. "Why?" "Habit interests me." Cecily studied her carefully. "You know something." "Oh, no," said Miss Marple mildly. "Merely several small things which don't fit together properly." For the first time genuine desperation flickered beneath Cecily's composure. "They'll convict me?" "No." The certainty in Miss Marple's voice startled her. "You sound very sure." "My dear, innocent people often behave badly under suspicion. Guilty people usually behave carefully." Cecily turned toward the fire. "You don't understand what Rose Hill was like when I was young. I think perhaps I do. They wanted me punished long before Leonard Pike died." Miss Marple said nothing. After a moment Cecily laughed bitterly. A pretty girl who liked admiration. Villages never forgive that sort of thing. "No," Miss Marple agreed quietly, "particularly from other women." The younger woman looked sharply at her. "You notice everything, don't you?" Miss Marple smiled. "Only human nature. And human nature repeats itself with extraordinary consistency." As she departed Harrow House, one thought lingered strongly in her mind. The murderer had understood village prejudice very well indeed. Too well, perhaps. That afternoon Inspector Graves visited Rose Hill Post Office to make inquiries regarding the arsenic found in Cecily's powder compact. The chemist from Medchester had confirmed it matched ordinary commercial arsenic, nothing distinctive. "But surely," Graves argued impatiently, "someone must have purchased it locally." The postmistress shook her head. "Rat poison, perhaps, but not recently." The inspector left increasingly dissatisfied. The case looked perfect from a distance, yet troublesome close at hand. Back at the station he reviewed witness statements once more. Motive, clear. Opportunity, undeniable. Physical evidence, substantial. And still something irritated him. Too neat, perhaps. He disliked neat cases. They often collapsed. Meanwhile, Miss Marple pursued a different line entirely. Just before tea she called unexpectedly upon Mrs. Pike. The widow received her with strained politeness. "You're very kind." "My dear Mrs. Pike, one remembers how dreadful those first days can be." Mrs. Pike's hands tightened slightly. "You've experienced bereavement?" "Oh, yes." There followed one of those small silences during which people sometimes reveal themselves unintentionally. Then Miss Marple said gently, "You must miss your routines terribly." Mrs. Pike looked startled. "Routinous? Tea-trays, household matters, the little habits of marriage." A faint shadow crossed the widow's face. Leonard liked things precise. "Men often do." Miss Marple's gaze drifted innocently toward the tea-service arranged on the sideboard. Only 1 green cup stood there now, without a handle. "How odd," said Miss Marple lightly. "I thought there were 2 of those cups here before." Mrs. Pike went perfectly still, only for a moment, but Miss Marple saw it. "A second one?" Mrs. Pike repeated. "Yes." "Perhaps I'm mistaken." "You must be." Miss Marple smiled apologetically. "At my age one confuses things dreadfully." Yet as she walked home through the cooling dusk, she was quite certain she had not confused anything at all, because when she first visited after Leonard Pike's death, she had seen 2 green cups in the Pike household, one on the tray of condolence letters, and another drying beside the kitchen sink. At the time it had seemed meaningless. Now it seemed extraordinarily important. Someone had removed one of the cups, and only someone inside the Pike household could have done so quietly after the murder. That evening, while the village settled behind drawn curtains and cautious whispers, Miss Marple sat alone beside her lamp, turning over the problem carefully in her mind. Then suddenly she remembered something else, not about the cups, about Mrs. Pike herself. Years ago, during a church jumble sale, Mrs. Pike had once corrected a bill Leonard Pike had paid incorrectly down to the exact penny. Leonard had laughed before everyone and said, "My wife notices every little thing." quite wasted as a solicitor's clerk. Everyone had laughed, but Mrs. Pike had flushed scarlet. Miss Marple laid down her knitting slowly. Overlooked people, she reflected, often noticed far more than anyone imagined, and sometimes after many years they stopped enduring humiliation quietly. The news reached Rose Hill shortly after 7 the next morning, carried first by the baker's boy, then by the milk cart, and finally confirmed by the church verger, who possessed a solemn relish for catastrophe. Edith Bell was dead. By breakfast time the entire village knew she had been found at the foot of the old quarry path beyond Harrow Lane. Some said she had slipped in the rain. Others insisted she had run away in fright and fallen accidentally. Very few believed either explanation. Miss Marple received the news from Dr. Haydock himself, who arrived pale and visibly disturbed. "She's gone," he said quietly as Florence admitted him. Miss Marple set down her teacup very carefully. "How?" "A fractured skull. The police say she fell, but you do not think so." Haydock removed his spectacles wearily. "No." He sat heavily near the fire. "She had bruising on one wrist, fresh bruising." Miss Marple's face grew grave. "The poor child. She was terrified yesterday." "Yes." The doctor looked at her sharply. "You think she was killed because of what she saw?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Outside, the morning lay cold and colorless beneath low clouds. Somewhere in the distance a rook called harshly. Finally she said softly, "People who commit one murder often discover a second becomes easier." A silence followed. Then Dr. Haydock added reluctantly, "Inspector Graves is more convinced than ever about Cecily Harrow." Miss Marple's eyes lifted. "How absurd! The quarry path lies near Harrowland. My dear doctor, in villages nearly everything lies near somebody's land." Haydock gave a tired smile. "You should tell Graves that." "Oh, no," said Miss Marple. "One must allow policemen the dignity of arriving at truths themselves." By 10 o'clock the quarry path had become the center of village fascination. Small groups gathered beyond police barriers pretending concern while observing everything avidly. Mrs. Ellison arrived carrying sandwiches for the constables and remained nearly an hour. Inspector Graves stood near the path entrance, studying the muddy ground with mounting frustration. The rain had ruined most footprints. A constable approached. "No sign of struggle, sir." "There was a struggle," Graves snapped. "The doctor confirmed bruising." "Yes, sir." "And the girl was afraid before she died." The constable hesitated. "You still think Miss Harrow?" Graves looked toward Harrow House, visible beyond the distant trees. "I think someone silenced a witness." But inwardly doubt had begun spreading through his neat theory like cracks through ice. If Cecily Harrow truly feared Edith Bell talking about the teacups, why not prevent it earlier? Why wait until after the arrest, when suspicion already rested firmly upon her? It felt clumsy. Not at all like the calculated poisoning at the fete. Near noon Miss Marple walked slowly toward the churchyard, ostensibly to place flowers on an old friend's grave. In reality she wished to observe the village while shock remained fresh. People revealed themselves most clearly under strain. Near the lich gate she encountered Gerald Foster lighting a cigarette with visibly trembling hands. The young man looked exhausted. Dark shadows marked his face. "Terrible business," he muttered. "Yes, indeed." Gerald avoided her eyes. "Poor girl." Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully. "You knew Edith Bell?" "Slightly." "Did you speak with her recently?" His match burned nearly to his fingers before he dropped it. "Why should I?" "Oh, no reason." He gave a strained laugh. "Everyone's acting as though the whole village consists of murderers." "My dear boy," said Miss Marple gently, "villages always contain every variety of human nature. One simply notices it more during scandals." Gerald crushed his cigarette violently. "I suppose now they'll hang Cecily Harrow." An odd note entered his voice at the name. Protectiveness, perhaps, or fear. "Would that distress you?" Miss Marple asked quietly. He looked at her sharply. She didn't do it. The certainty surprised her. "How can you be so sure?" For one brief second panic flashed across his face. Then he recovered. "I just know." He walked away too quickly afterward. Miss Marple watched him disappear beyond the graves. Young Gerald Foster, ruined financially by Leonard Pike. Young Gerald Foster, still handsome enough to attract sympathy. And young Gerald Foster, plainly anxious about Cecily Harrow. Very interesting indeed. That afternoon Inspector Graves called unexpectedly at Harrow House once more. Cecily received him standing beside the library fire. "You've come to accuse me of another death?" The inspector studied her carefully. "You aren't particularly shocked. Should I be? Rose Hill decided I was guilty 2 days ago." Graves removed his gloves slowly. "Where were you last night between 8 and 10? "At home." "Can anyone confirm that?" "My maid retired early." "In other words, no." Cecily's eyes flashed. "You want me frightened?" "Unfortunately, Inspector, I spent years learning not to oblige unpleasant men." Graves ignored the remark. "Did Edith Bell ever speak to you about the teacups?" A pause followed. "No." He watched her narrowly. "You understand this looks increasingly serious." Cecily laughed suddenly. "Does it? Or does it merely look convenient?" The inspector said nothing. As he prepared to leave, Cecily spoke again. "You know what's amusing? Leonard Pike would have enjoyed this enormously." Graves turned. "What do you mean?" He adored seeing people judged, especially women. For the first time, genuine hatred entered her voice. "He spent years deciding what everyone in Rose Hill deserved." After the inspector departed, Cecily remained motionless beside the fire. Then slowly she opened a desk drawer and removed a letter. Its edges were worn from repeated handling. The signature at the bottom read, "Leonard Pike." Outside, twilight descended early beneath gathering rain clouds. Miss Marple spent the evening quietly considering everything she knew: the poison, the switched cups, Edith Bell's fear. And now the second death. The pattern had changed. The first murder was cold and deliberate. The second carried panic, which meant the murderer had not expected Edith Bell to notice the cups, and afterward someone had become frightened enough to kill again. Miss Marple's knitting rested forgotten in her lap. Then, quite suddenly, another memory returned to her, small, trivial, but oddly disturbing. On the day of the fete, just before the screaming began, she had seen Miss Pike carrying a tray of fresh napkins toward the committee-room corridor. At the time it seemed entirely natural, except for one thing. Mrs. Pike had claimed afterward she never entered the room before Leonard Pike collapsed. Miss Marple sat very still. In villages, she reflected, wives became nearly invisible after sufficient years of marriage. People stopped observing them, stopped listening, stopped imagining they possessed feelings dangerous enough to matter. And that, perhaps, was the gravest mistake of all. A pale fog settled over Rose Hill the following morning, softening hedges and rooftops until the village appeared suspended in cloud. Lamps still glowed faintly behind curtained windows, though it was nearly 9 o'clock, and footsteps along the lanes sounded unnaturally muffled. Miss Marple liked fog even less than she liked excitement. Fog concealed expressions. She sat in her cottage parlor with a slice of toast growing cold beside her while she considered the increasingly troubling shape of the case. 2 murders now. That altered everything. One murder might arise from passion, panic, greed, humiliation, or fear. But a second killing nearly always revealed character. And character, Miss Marple believed firmly, mattered more than evidence. Florence entered carrying the morning paper. "They've printed Miss Harrow's photograph, miss." "How?" "Photograph, miss. How unpleasant. The headline says Village Beauty's Poisoned Secret." Miss Marple sighed faintly. "Journalists do so enjoy adjectives." The maid lingered. "Do you think she did it?" "No." Florence blinked. "But the police—" "My dear Florence, policemen are often extremely clever. Unfortunately, they are also very fond of straightforward solutions." After breakfast, Miss Marple paid a call upon Dr. Haydock. She found him in his surgery reading the laboratory report from Edith Bell's post-mortem with increasing annoyance. "There was dirt beneath her fingernails," he said immediately. "She fought someone." Miss Marple nodded. "And the bruise on the wrist?" "Strong grip, likely inflicted shortly before death." The doctor removed his spectacles. "She didn't fall accidentally." "No." Haydock leaned back tiredly. "Graves knows it too, but he still believes Harrow somehow arranged both murders." "Does he?" "He says desperation makes people reckless." Miss Marple considered. "That is true sometimes, but not here?" "No." She folded her hands quietly. "The first crime required planning and patience. The second required fear. Those are rather different emotions." The doctor studied her. "You know who it is, don't you?" "Oh, no," said Miss Marple. "Not quite, but in truth she was very close." Later that afternoon an unexpected visitor arrived at her cottage. It was Gerald Foster. He looked exhausted and badly shaved, his usually easy charm replaced by visible strain. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all." He remained standing awkwardly near the fireplace. "I wanted to ask something." "Yes?" "Do you really think Cecily Harrow is innocent?" Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully. "You are very concerned for Miss Harrow." Color rose faintly in his face. "She's had everyone against her from the beginning." "That was not precisely my observation." He frowned. "What do you mean?" "My dear boy, half the village was fascinated by her long before they condemned her. Villages often dislike women they secretly admire." Gerald gave a restless movement. "She doesn't belong here any more." "Perhaps not." There was silence. Then he said abruptly, "Leonard Pike destroyed my life." Miss Marple waited. "He advised my father about investments years ago. Safe ventures, he called them. Father lost nearly everything before he died." "And you blame Mr. Pike?" Gerald laughed bitterly. "Everyone blamed me instead. That's the amusing part." His voice hardened. "Pike always escaped consequences. Always." Miss Marple observed him quietly. Humiliation. Financial desperation. Perfect motives. Yet something still felt wrong. "Did you quarrel with him at the fete?" she asked gently. Gerald hesitated. "In public?" "Not exactly." "What about?" "He warned me to stay away from Cecily." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened slightly. "Why?" "He said she attracted scandal." "How considerate of him!" Gerald smiled grimly. "He enjoyed controlling people." There it was again. The same phrase. Miss Marple noticed repetitions carefully. "Did Miss Harrow care for Mr. Pike?" Gerald stared. "Good God, no. Hatred can resemble attachment sometimes. She despised him." "And you?" For one brief moment something dangerous flickered across the young man's face. Then it vanished. "I wanted him ruined," he admitted quietly. "Not dead. Ruined." The distinction mattered enormously. After Gerald departed, Miss Marple sat very still beside the fire. Then slowly she rose and put on her coat. There was somewhere she needed to visit. The Pike house stood unnaturally silent beneath the fog. Mrs. Pike herself answered the door, looking pale and exhausted. "My dear Mrs. Pike, I wondered whether I might sit with you a while." The widow hesitated only briefly before admitting her. The drawing-room smelled faintly of lavender water and stale grief. Miss Marple accepted tea while Mrs. Pike poured with trembling precision. "You must forgive the disorder," she murmured. "Everything seems impossible suddenly." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "Death rearranges ordinary life dreadfully." Her eyes drifted around the room. Leonard Pike's presence lingered everywhere: neat papers, polished furniture, carefully ordered books. The atmosphere of a man who valued control. "Have the police finished examining Mr. Pike's study?" Miss Marple asked lightly. "I believe so." "How exhausting for you." Mrs. Pike gave a weak smile. "They searched every drawer." "Of course." The widow lowered her gaze. "They seemed to think Leonard kept secrets." Miss Marple sipped tea thoughtfully. "Did he?" A silence followed. Then, very quietly, Mrs. Pike's hands tightened around her cup. "He liked knowing things about people, financial troubles, affairs." Her voice grew strained. "It made him feel powerful." Miss Marple said gently, "That must have been difficult." For the first time emotion cracked through the widow's composure. "You cannot imagine." The words escaped almost violently. Then Mrs. Pike seemed startled by herself. "I'm sorry, my dear. No one understands what it's like living beside someone who watches constantly, corrects constantly." She laughed shakily. "Even tea trays had rules." Miss Marple's eyes rested on her kindly. "And if the rules were broken?" "He would notice." Very interesting indeed. A few minutes later, while Mrs. Pike briefly left the room to answer the telephone, Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the partially open study door across the hall. Something instinct perhaps drew her quietly forward. The study remained much as Leonard Pike had left it. Dark mahogany desk, orderly shelves, a faint lingering scent of cigars. Miss Marple moved carefully, not touching anything unnecessarily. Then she noticed the drawer, not fully closed. Inside lay correspondence bundled neatly with ribbon, and among them a single loose letter. Its handwriting was unmistakably feminine. Miss Marple read only the visible line before footsteps approached behind her. "You shouldn't be in here." Mrs. Pike stood in the doorway, pale as paper. Miss Marple turned calmly. "My apologies. I fear old women wander dreadfully." The widow's eyes moved instantly toward the open drawer. Then something extraordinary happened. For one brief second the timid Mrs. Pike vanished entirely. What remained was naked fear, not grief, not shock. Then the expression disappeared. "It doesn't matter," she whispered. Miss Marple closed the drawer gently. "No," she said softly. "I think perhaps it matters very much." She left soon afterward. Outside, the fog had begun lifting slowly from the village. As Miss Marple walked home, one thought settled firmly into place. The murderer was not merely protecting themselves now. They were protecting the past, and whatever Leonard Pike kept hidden inside that desk frightened Mrs. Pike far more than the police ever could. By Thursday, Rosehill had acquired the strained politeness common to villagers during scandal. People still greeted one another warmly in the street, but every conversation carried an undercurrent of caution, as though anyone might suddenly become dangerous. Curtains twitched constantly, doors closed more quickly, and everywhere, beneath the ordinary rituals of village life, fear moved quietly from house to house. Miss Marple noticed another change as well. People had stopped discussing Leonard Pike with affection. Death often improved reputations temporarily, but Leonard Pike's had begun deteriorating almost at once. Too many old grievances had survived him. At the grocer's, Mrs. Finch remarked darkly that certain men mistake influence for virtue. Near the churchyard, Colonel Avery muttered something about damned interference in other people's affairs. Even Mrs. Greeley admitted Leonard Pike had possessed a rather overdeveloped sense of authority. Only his widow remained beyond criticism. Poor Mrs. Pike, quiet Mrs. Pike, invisible Mrs. Pike. Miss Marple found that particularly interesting. That afternoon she visited the solicitor's office in Medchester under the perfectly legitimate pretense of discussing an old charitable trust. Mr. Edgar Moulton, Pike's junior partner, received her with weary courtesy. "A dreadful business, Miss Marple." "Yes, indeed." Mr. Moulton looked relieved when she began discussing legal matters. Men frequently underestimated elderly women until conversation drifted unexpectedly. "Mr. Pike must have carried enormous responsibilities," Miss Marple observed mildly. "Oh, yes." Clients trusted him completely. "And his wife assisted him?" The solicitor blinked. "Mrs. Pike?" "Well." "She typed some correspondence occasionally. She was efficient?" "Exceptionally so, actually." Miss Marple adjusted her gloves. "Did she understand legal matters?" A faint smile touched Moulton's face. "Between ourselves, Mrs. Pike noticed errors before anyone else, figures especially." He laughed softly. "Pike used to joke she should have become the solicitor." "What a pity she did not," said Miss Marple quietly. As she left the office, another small piece settled neatly into place. Not timid, not foolish, merely trained for years to remain in the background. There was an enormous difference. That evening Inspector Graves finally came to see Miss Marple again. He appeared tired, irritable, and increasingly dissatisfied with his own case. "You were right," he admitted abruptly after accepting tea. "My dear Inspector, I'm sure I've been wrong about many things. The evidence against Miss Harrow no longer fits properly." Miss Marple said nothing. Graves removed a notebook from his pocket. "We found fingerprints on the arsenic compact." "Yes?" "Not Harrow's." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused softly. "How awkward." "The prints were smudged intentionally, but enough remained to establish they belonged to someone else." He leaned forward. "And Edith Bell's death changes everything. If Harrow already faced conviction, why risk another murder?" "Precisely." The inspector frowned. "You seem remarkably unsurprised." "Oh dear, old women are seldom surprised by human behavior." He studied her carefully. "You suspect someone?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I suspect several things. That isn't helpful." "No," she agreed, "but it is often accurate." The inspector exhaled impatiently. "You know, everyone says you solve murders by knitting quietly and comparing people to villagers from 30 years ago." "How unfair," said Miss Marple mildly. "Sometimes it is 40 years." Despite himself, Graves almost smiled. Then his expression hardened again. "There's something else. We searched Pike's study thoroughly today." Miss Marple looked up. "We found letters." "So Leonard Pike was blackmailing people?" she asked softly. The inspector hesitated. "Not directly, but he kept copies of private correspondence, financial records, personal information." Financial records, personal information. Graves' face darkened. "Enough to pressure half the county if he wished." Miss Marple sighed. "Power is a very intoxicating thing for small men." "There was one particular letter," Graves continued carefully, "from Cecily Harrow." Miss Marple waited. "It accused Pike of stealing money from her father's estate, and threatened public scandal. That cannot have pleased him." "No." Graves leaned back. "But the letter was old, nearly 15 years old." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened instantly. 15? How curious! The inspector frowned. "You find that significant?" "My dear Inspector, people rarely preserve old threats unless they continue serving some purpose." There was silence. Then Graves said slowly, "You think Pike kept damaging information on purpose, and someone feared exposure after his death." Miss Marple resumed knitting calmly. "Now you are thinking properly." The inspector rose eventually to leave. At the door he paused. "One more thing. Mrs. Pike claims she never entered her husband's study without permission." Miss Marple's expression remained perfectly mild. "Did she indeed? You don't believe her?" "No married woman spends 30 years in a house without entering a study." Graves looked at her sharply. "You really think she matters to this?" Miss Marple met his gaze quietly. "My dear Inspector, the person everyone overlooks is nearly always the person worth watching." After he departed, evening settled softly over Rose Hill. Miss Marple sat beside the fire reflecting on Mrs. Pike. Timid women, quiet women, women whose personalities gradually disappeared beneath years of correction and dismissal. Such women often frighten nobody at all. And yet Miss Marple remembered another woman long ago in St. Mary Mead, gentle Mrs. Carruthers, who endured 22 years of humiliation before finally setting fire to her husband's prized chrysanthemums during the village flower show. The destruction had been astonishingly thorough. People always underestimated the emotional force of long endurance. The following morning brought another development. Florence entered Miss Marple's breakfast room, visibly excited. "There's been another row at Harrow House." "Oh?" Colonel Avery was there shouting. Miss Marple looked interested. "Really?" "They say Mr. Gerald Foster nearly struck him." How very dramatic, thought Miss Marple. An hour later she encountered Colonel Avery himself near the post office. He looked furious. "That damned young fool." "Gerald Foster?" The colonel stared. "How did you know?" "My dear Colonel, Rose Hill spreads information with marvelous efficiency." He muttered something inaudible. "Argument about Miss Harrow?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Yeah." The colonel's face hardened. "Foster insists she's innocent, and you disagree." "Of course I disagree." His tone carried unusual force. Miss Marple observed him thoughtfully. "You seem deeply invested in Miss Harrow's guilt." Color rose faintly in the colonel's face. "Nonsense. No?" For a moment he looked genuinely uncomfortable. Then abruptly he said, "Cecily Harrow ruins people," and walked away. Miss Marple watched him go slowly down the lane. Another man emotionally entangled with Cecily Harrow. Another old resentment, another damaged pride. Villages, she reflected, were astonishingly repetitive. But as she turned toward home, a different realization came suddenly and clearly. Everyone connected to Cecily Harrow reacted emotionally. Resentment. Everyone except Mrs. Pike. And that perhaps was the strangest thing of all. Miss Marple believed firmly that truth often emerged most naturally over tea. People guarded themselves during formal questioning. They became careful under suspicion. But give them a teapot, thin bread and butter, and the reassuring rituals of English domestic life, and remarkable things escaped unnoticed into conversation. Accordingly, she invited Mrs. Pike to tea. The invitation was accepted with visible surprise. At precisely 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon, Mrs. Pike arrived at the cottage wearing a plain grey coat and the exhausted expression of someone moving through events rather than living them. "My dear Mrs. Pike," said Miss Marple warmly. "How nice!" The little parlour glowed with firelight and late autumn roses arranged in bowls. Florence had laid out seed cakes, scones, and raspberry jam with particular care. For several minutes they discussed entirely ordinary matters: the weather, church repairs, the unreliability of rationing during the war years. Miss Marple observed quietly as Mrs. Pike gradually relaxed beneath the soothing familiarity of harmless conversation. Only afterward did she say gently, "You were very devoted to your husband." Mrs. Pike's hand tightened slightly around her cup. 30 years is a long marriage." Again the tiny hesitation. Miss Marple buttered a scone delicately. "Men who enjoy authority can sometimes become difficult husbands." Mrs. Pike stared into her tea. "Leonard liked things orderly." "Yes." "He disliked mistakes." "I see." Another silence. Then Mrs. Pike said suddenly, "Everyone thinks widows become free after death." Miss Marple looked up softly. "But they do not?" The older woman gave a faint, almost bewildered smile. "One becomes accustomed to obedience." The words carried no self-pity. That made them infinitely sadder. Miss Marple said gently, "And yet you were clearly a very capable woman." Mrs. Pike looked genuinely startled. "Capable? "Oh, yes. Mr. Moulton speaks highly of your work." Color rose faintly in the widow's cheeks. "Edgar exaggerates. He says you notice legal errors others missed." A shadow crossed Mrs. Pike's face. "Leonard disliked that. Why?" "He said wives ought not outshine husbands." Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "How exhausting for you." Mrs. Pike gave a sudden, quiet laugh. "You make it sound dreadful." "My dear," said Miss Marple softly, "I think perhaps it was." For one fleeting moment tears filled the widow's eyes. Then immediately she mastered herself again. Years of practice, thought Miss Marple. A little later, as Florence cleared the tray, Miss Marple said casually, "I was sorry to hear Edith Bell died before speaking fully to the police." Mrs. Pike's teacup rattled faintly against the saucer. "She was only a servant girl. She may have imagined things." "Possibly." Miss Marple looked at her kindly. "Though frightened girls usually fear something real." Mrs. Pike said nothing. The fire crackled softly between them. Then Miss Marple added in the gentlest voice imaginable, "She saw someone touch the teacups after Leonard collapsed." Mrs. Pike went completely still, not dramatically, not guiltily, but with the absolute stillness of a person who suddenly understands danger has arrived. Miss Marple watched her quietly. After several seconds, Mrs. Pike whispered, "Did she say who?" "No." The widow lowered her gaze at once. Very interesting indeed. An innocent person would almost certainly have asked when or why, but Mrs. Pike had asked who. Miss Marple changed the subject immediately afterward, discussing village charities until her guest departed shortly before dusk. At the door Mrs. Pike paused unexpectedly. "Miss Marple?" "Yes, my dear? Do you ever think people can be driven too far?" The question hung quietly in the cooling air. Miss Marple answered carefully. Mrs. Pike looked away. "I used to think good women endured everything. And now?" A long silence followed. Then the widow said very softly, "I'm no longer certain." After she left, Miss Marple remained standing by the door for some time. The pattern was becoming heartbreakingly clear now. Not sudden violence, not greed alone, but years of humiliation, control, and buried anger slowly compressed into something unbearable. And yet one thing still troubled her deeply. Mrs. Pike might well have murdered her husband, but Edith Bell murdered her husband. But Edith Bell, that second death still felt wrong, too physical, too desperate, too unlike the quiet precision of poisoning. Miss Marple sat down abruptly. Unless there had been two people protecting the same secret. At 7:30 Inspector Graves arrived once more, rain-speckled and grim. "You are correct again." "How tiresome for you," said Miss Marple sympathetically. He ignored this. "We found evidence someone entered Pike's study after his death." "Yes?" "A drawer had been searched recently. Papers disturbed." Miss Marple folded her hands. "And what was missing?" The inspector stared. "How did you know something was missing?" "My dear Inspector, people rarely search carefully through papers merely for exercise." Graves exhaled sharply. "A bundle of letters. From whom?" "That's the difficulty. Mrs. Pike claims ignorance." Miss Marple looked thoughtful. "Did Leonard Pike have affairs?" The inspector hesitated. "Several, apparently." "How unpleasant." "One affair in particular seems significant." Miss Marple waited patiently. "With a woman named Clara Morton, housemaid originally. It ended years ago after she married elsewhere." "And?" "She died nearly a decade ago." The inspector removed a folded paper from his pocket. "We found financial payments made quietly to her husband afterward." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened slightly. "Hush money?" "Possibly." The room fell silent. Then Miss Marple asked very softly, "Did the Mortons have children?" Graves blinked. "One daughter." "What?" "What became of her?" The inspector frowned, searching memory. "She worked locally at one point." Suddenly both spoke at once. "Edith Bell." Silence crashed into the room. Inspector Graves stared at her. "Good Lord!" Miss Marple sat very still. Now at last the second murder made dreadful sense. Edith Bell had not merely seen something. She had known something already. Something connected to Leonard Pike. Something dangerous enough to survive for years. The inspector rose abruptly. "If Pike was Edith Bell's father, then Leonard Pike may have spent years paying quietly to avoid scandal," Miss Marple finished. "And Edith might have discovered documents proving it." "Yes." Graves paced toward the fireplace. "Which means someone feared those papers emerging after Pike's death." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And Edith herself may have realized it." The inspector stopped. "You think she confronted someone?" perhaps unintentionally. Outside, rain lashed suddenly against the windows. The room seemed smaller now, tighter with possibility. Then Miss Marple spoke the thought she had been resisting. What if Edith Bell was not killed to protect Leonard Pike? Graves turned sharply. What else? Miss Marple's voice became very quiet. What if she was killed to protect Mrs. Pike? Inspector Graves did not speak for several moments after Miss Marple's suggestion. Rain hammered steadily against the cottage windows while the firelight flickered across his troubled face. At first glance, he said slowly, that sounds absurd. Yes, said Miss Marple. Most truths do initially. The inspector resumed pacing. You think Mrs. Pike discovered her husband fathered Edith Bell? My dear Inspector, I suspect she discovered it years ago. And remained silent? Miss Marple gave him a mild look. Wives remain silent about astonishing things. Graves frowned deeply. But why would Edith's existence matter now? Because Leonard Pike was dead. The inspector stopped. Miss Marple continued quietly. A living man controls secrets. A dead man loses control of papers, letters, evidence. She folded her hands. Suppose Edith Bell realized after Pike's death that proof existed somewhere inside that study, and she searched for it, or threatened. Graves considered. That would certainly alarm Mrs. Pike. Yes, but poisoning Leonard Pike still seems elaborate. Miss Marple looked thoughtfully into the fire. Not elaborate, personal. The inspector waited. Poison administered through tea possesses intimacy, domestic familiarity. It belongs to someone inside ordinary routine. He said nothing. After a moment, Miss Marple added gently, Men imagine murder comes from hatred. Women often arrive there through exhaustion. A silence followed. Then Graves asked quietly, You really believe Mrs. Pike killed her husband? Miss Marple's knitting rested motionless in her lap. I believe she endured him for 30 years. The inspector left shortly afterward, carrying with him an expression Miss Marple had seen before on policemen approaching unpleasant truths, not triumph. Weariness? The following morning dawned cold and bright after the storm. Rose Hill seemed scrubbed clean by rain, though tension still lingered beneath every polite greeting. Miss Marple spent the morning in her garden clipping dead roses while considering the final loose threads. Because there were still loose threads, the switched teacups, the missing letters, Edith Bell's terror, and perhaps most importantly of all the emotional contradictions surrounding the second murder. Mrs. Pike could poison quietly. That Miss Marple understood perfectly. But Edith Bell had died violently near the quarry path after what appeared to be a struggle. Could Mrs. Pike truly have done that too? Miss Marple doubted it, which meant someone else had become involved afterward, someone protecting her. Near 11 o'clock, Gerald Foster appeared at the cottage gate. He looked worse than ever, pale, sleepless, and visibly strained. Miss Marple, may I speak with you? Of course. Inside, he refused tea immediately. I know the police are changing their minds about Cecily. Miss Marple watched him carefully. They think Mrs. Pike may be involved now. How observant villagers are. Gerald gave a restless movement. She suffered, you know. Mrs. Pike? His voice sharpened unexpectedly. People act as though Leonard Pike was respectable simply because he wore proper suits and sat on committees. Strong feeling again. Miss Marple said softly, You disliked him very much. He humiliated people. Gerald stared toward the window. He enjoyed it. For a moment, genuine anger broke through his composure. Men like Pike destroy lives quietly, and everyone excuses them because they remain polite. Miss Marple looked at him thoughtfully. My dear boy, you seem remarkably protective of Mrs. Pike. Gerald froze. Then he laughed too quickly. She's harmless. Yes, said Miss Marple. That is exactly what everyone believes. Silence stretched between them. Then Gerald asked abruptly, If someone suffered enough, would you condemn them for striking back? Miss Marple answered carefully, I think suffering explains many things, but it does not erase consequences. He lowered his head briefly. You're kinder than the police. No, said Miss Marple softly. Only older. After he departed, Miss Marple remained very still. Now she was nearly certain, not only about Mrs. Pike, about Gerald Foster too. The poor boy was frightened, not for himself primarily, for someone else. That afternoon Inspector Graves returned with new information. We traced the missing letters. Yes, one of the constables discovered burned paper fragments in the Pike kitchen grate. How unfortunate. Graves sat heavily. Partially destroyed correspondence. Enough survived to identify Leonard Pike's handwriting. Miss Marple nodded slowly. There were references to regular payments made for Edith Bell's upbringing. The inspector rubbed his forehead. Mrs. Pike knew everything. She endured her husband's affair, supported the illegitimate child secretly, and continued living beside him for years. Miss Marple said quietly, "Many women of her generation believed endurance itself was virtue." Graves looked grim. One letter included a line I can't stop thinking about. "What line?" The inspector unfolded a notebook. "You ought to remember that scandal ruins women, not men." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. That sounded exactly like Leonard Pike. Graves continued, "There's more. Edith Bell apparently confronted Mrs. Pike 2 nights before her death." Miss Marple looked up sharply. "About the letters?" "We think so." "How do you know?" "A shopkeeper overheard part of the argument near the lane." Graves' expression darkened. Edith shouted, "I'm tired of secrets ruining people." The room fell silent. Miss Marple thought suddenly of Edith Bell, frightened, angry, perhaps newly aware of her true parentage and the years of concealment surrounding it. A servant girl all her life, while Leonard Pike sat comfortably at village teas pretending respectability. "Yes," she murmured softly, "that might indeed provoke someone." The inspector leaned forward. "You still think Mrs. Pike killed Leonard?" "And Edith?" Miss Marple hesitated. "No." Graves stared. "You're certain?" "Quite." "Why?" Miss Marple folded her hands carefully. "Because Edith Bell's death was emotional." She looked directly at him. "Mistress Pike kills through silence, not violence." The inspector considered this uneasily. "Then who?" Miss Marple rose slowly and crossed toward the window. Outside, late sunlight touched the quiet village green where ordinary life persisted stubbornly despite scandal and death. Then she said softly, "Someone who loved her." That evening, while dusk settled over Rosehill, Miss Marple paid one final unexpected visit not to Mrs. Pike, but to Cecily Harrow. She found her standing alone in the neglected garden among dead roses and fallen leaves. "You've come with news?" Cecily studied her carefully. "You know who did it?" Miss Marple gave a small sigh. "I believe I do." "And the police?" "They are approaching it slowly." Cecily laughed bitterly. "Slowly?" "They nearly hanged me first." Miss Marple touched one fading rose gently. "My dear, villages require villains. You were convenient." Cecily looked away. "I've been convenient all my life." There was silence. Then Miss Marple asked unexpectedly, "Did Gerald Foster love you?" Cecily blinked. "What?" "He does, you know." A faint shadow crossed her face. "Poor Gerald. He mistakes pity for love, does he?" Cecily turned sharply. "What are you implying?" Miss Marple looked at her quietly. "I think Gerald Foster may not love you at all." The younger woman stared. Then slowly understanding began dawning across her face. "Oh, indeed." Because suddenly everything fit together at last. Not Cecily Harrow, not obsession, not romantic jealousy, but something far older and sadder. A frightened young man trying desperately to protect the broken woman everyone overlooked. Miss Marple slept very little that night. Not from excitement, she had long since passed the age when mysteries produced excitement, but because certain conclusions carried sadness with them, and sadness rarely encouraged restful sleep. By morning she knew exactly what must be done. The difficulty lay not in discovering the truth, but in proving it. Inspector Graves arrived shortly after 10 o'clock, summoned by a brief note requesting a small consultation regarding village psychology. He entered the cottage looking skeptical and undercaffeinated. "You've solved it." Miss Marple adjusted the flowers on her mantelpiece. "I think so." "My dear Inspector, one must never rush revelations. It alarms people unnecessarily." Graves sat down heavily. "Please alarm me." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Mrs. Pike poisoned her husband." The inspector nodded slowly. "That much I've nearly accepted." "Yes, the tea-tray arrangement makes it quite clear once one understands household habit." "The handleless green cup," said Miss Marple. "Mrs. Pike always used it herself during private committee teas because Leonard Pike disliked it. Therefore everyone unconsciously associated that cup with her." Graves frowned. "But Pike drank from the poisoned cup, precisely because someone switched the cups afterward." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Pike prepared the poisoned tea intending Leonard Pike to drink from an ordinary cup, but after his collapse she panicked, and replaced it with the distinctive green one to implicate Cecily Harrow." "Yes." Since identical cups existed at Harrow House, suspicion naturally shifted toward Cecily. The inspector rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. That explains the switched cups, and Edith Bell saw it happen. Exactly. Graves nodded slowly. But Edith's murder? Miss Marple was silent a moment. Mrs. Pike did not kill Edith Bell. You're certain? Quite. The inspector looked impatient. Then who did? Miss Marple sighed softly. My dear Inspector Gerald Foster. Silence filled the room. Finally Graves said flatly, Gerald Foster? Why in heaven's name would he protect Mrs. Pike? Miss Marple looked at him with quiet sympathy. Because he loved her. The inspector stared as though she had suggested the vicar secretly ran a circus. That's impossible. No, said Miss Marple gently. Only uncomfortable. She continued calmly. Gerald Foster lost his father young. Financial ruin followed Leonard Pike's advice. Mrs. Pike, meanwhile, spent years being kind quietly, the sort of kindness unnoticed by most people. Graves frowned deeply. A mother fixation? Oh, no. Nothing so theatrical. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Lonely people often recognize unhappiness in one another. The inspector remained unconvinced. And you believe Gerald discovered Mrs. Pike committed the murder? How? Probably after Edith Bell became frightened about the teacups. Mrs. Pike may have confided in him partially, or perhaps he guessed. Miss Marple's expression saddened. The poor boy believed he was rescuing her. Graves stood and began pacing again. So Gerald kills Edith Bell to silence her. Yeah. A second murder committed impulsively while protecting Mrs. Pike. Exactly. Entirely different in temperament from the poisoning. The inspector stopped abruptly. Can you prove any of this? Miss Marple looked toward the window. That is where village psychology becomes useful. An hour later, invitations began quietly circulating through Rosehill. Miss Marple requested the presence of several individuals at her cottage that evening for what she termed a small clarification regarding unfortunate misunderstandings. By 7 o'clock the parlor contained Inspector Graves, Dr. Haydock, Colonel Avery, Cecily Harrow, Mrs. Pike, and Gerald Foster. The atmosphere resembled a room awaiting thunderstorms. Mrs. Pike sat pale and rigid near the fireplace. Gerald hovered protectively beside her. Cecily Harrow looked amused but tired. Inspector Graves remained near the mantel, watching everyone carefully. Miss Marple herself poured tea with serene composure. One always thinks more clearly with tea, she remarked. Nobody replied. At last she settled into her chair. My dear friends, villages are rather dangerous places because people observe one another constantly while understanding very little. Avery shifted impatiently. Must we have riddles? Yes, said Miss Marple mildly. Truth often arrives disguised as one. She turned toward Mrs. Pike. When Leonard Pike died, everyone immediately suspected Cecily Harrow because the evidence appeared obvious. Cecily gave a cold smile. How flattering. But the evidence was too obvious, Miss Marple continued. Particularly the green teacup without the handle. Mrs. Pike's hands tightened invisibly. Miss Marple went on gently. That cup belonged originally to the Harrow china set. But Mrs. Pike herself had used the matching cup for years in her own household. Inspector Graves spoke quietly. Edith Bell saw someone change the cups afterward. Silence settled heavily. Miss Marple nodded. Yes. Mrs. Pike switched the cups after Leonard collapsed because panic overcame her. Mrs. Pike closed her eyes. Gerald stepped forward sharply. This is absurd. No, said Miss Marple softly. Only tragic. She turned kindly toward the widow. My dear Mrs. Pike, you endured humiliation for years. Leonard Pike controlled everyone around him through fear, criticism, and secrets. Eventually you could bear no more. Tears appeared suddenly in Mrs. Pike's eyes. He ruined people, she whispered. No one moved. Miss Marple's voice remained very gentle. The widow's composure broke at last. You don't understand what it was like. Her words came shakily now. The affairs, the lies, the endless corrections. She twisted her hands together helplessly. And Edith? A terrible silence followed. She was his child, Mrs. Pike whispered, and he expected me to help hide it, to pay quietly, to pretend nothing mattered. Gerald moved toward her instantly. He drove her to it, he said fiercely. Inspector Graves looked sharply at him. And Edith Bell? The young man froze. Miss Marple watched him sadly. Edith discovered the letters after Leonard's death, didn't she? Gerald's face drained of color. She threatened to expose everything. No, said Miss Marple softly. I think she threatened to expose Leonard Pike. Gerald looked down. She cornered Mrs. Pike near the quarry path. Miss Marple continued quietly. She was angry, and Mrs. Pike became frightened. She was angry. And Mrs. Pike became frightened. The room held its breath. Then Gerald spoke in a broken voice. She wouldn't stop. No one interrupted. She kept saying everyone would know. That Mrs. Pike was pathetic for protecting him all those years. His hands trembled visibly now. She made her cry. Mrs. Pike gave a small, horrified sound. Gerald shut his eyes briefly. I only meant to frighten her. Inspector Graves' voice became very calm. But you struck her. The word barely emerged. Silence flooded the room. Outside, rain began again softly against the windows. At last Mrs. Pike whispered, He turned toward her desperately. I couldn't let them destroy you too. The tragedy of it settled over the room then, not monstrous evil, but damaged people colliding through fear, shame, loneliness, and long-buried pain. Miss Marple looked quietly into the fire. Human beings, she reflected, so often mistook endurance for virtue until suffering finally curdled into destruction. Rain continued through the night, falling softly over Rose Hill like a curtain drawing closed upon a performance nobody wished to remember clearly. By morning the village had already begun its slow transformation of tragedy into memory. Not forgiveness, villages rarely forgave completely, but adjustment. Human beings possessed a remarkable ability to continue living beside dreadful knowledge so long as tea arrived punctually and shops opened on time. Gerald Foster was taken quietly to Medchester shortly after dawn. There had been no dramatic resistance. Indeed, he seemed almost relieved once confession finally freed him from the burden of fear. Mrs. Pike, however, collapsed entirely. Dr. Haydock insisted upon complete rest and refused all visitors except Miss Marple. She's near exhaustion, he said gravely that afternoon. Years of strain, and then this. Miss Marple nodded sadly. She still insists Leonard Pike's death was accidental. That is understandable. The doctor frowned. Understandable? My dear doctor, some women protect husbands even after hating them. Habit becomes stronger than truth sometimes. Haydock sighed heavily. You pity her. And Gerald? Miss Marple looked out toward the wet garden where late roses drooped beneath rainwater. Oh, yes, he said softly. Him too. The doctor gave an impatient movement. But he killed Edith Bell. And Mrs. Pike poisoned her husband. Then why pity either of them? Miss Marple folded her hands quietly. Because people are rarely born ready for murder, Doctor. They arrive there gradually through loneliness, humiliation, fear, and desperation. She paused. That is what makes such things terrible. Outside, Rose Hill continued its uneasy return to normality. At the post office, conversation resumed cautiously around weather and ration books before drifting inevitably back towards scandal. Mrs. Ellison declared Gerald Foster had always possessed weak moral character, despite having praised him consistently for years. Avery now insisted he had doubted the case against Cecily Harrow from the beginning. Miss Lavinia Trent whispered darkly that Mrs. Pike had hidden depth. Miss Marple found this last remark particularly irritating. People always sounded faintly disappointed when quiet women revealed intelligence or passion. 3 days later, Cecily Harrow visited the cottage. She arrived without ceremony, dressed in dark green and carrying a small parcel wrapped neatly in brown paper. I'm leaving Rose Hill tomorrow, she announced. Miss Marple looked unsurprised. Yes, I thought perhaps you might. Cecily sat near the fire. They'll never quite forgive me, you know. My dear, villages require someone to remember dramatically. A faint smile touched Cecily's mouth. You really do understand people. Oh, no, said Miss Marple modestly. Merely patterns. The younger woman glanced around the cozy parlor. I used to think you sentimental. And now? I think you see human beings too clearly to be sentimental. Miss Marple laughed softly. That is probably true. Cecily placed the parcel gently upon the table. I wanted you to have this. Inside lay a porcelain teacup painted with violets, without a handle. Miss Marple looked up in surprise. The last one from the set, Cecily said quietly. It seems appropriate somehow. Miss Marple touched the fragile china carefully. How extraordinary objects become after violence, she murmured. There was silence. Then Cecily asked unexpectedly, Do you believe Mrs. Pike loved Gerald Foster? Miss Marple considered before answering. No. Cecily looked relieved and saddened simultaneously. But she needed him, Miss Marple continued gently, and lonely young men often mistake being needed for love. Cecily stared into the fire. He would have ruined his life for her. Another silence followed. Then Cecily said quietly, Leonard Pike nearly ruined mine once." Miss Marple looked up. At last, the final truth. Cecily smiled faintly without humor. "When I was 23, he offered to help with father's debts." Her voice hardened. "The price was marriage." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened softly. "And when you refused, he spread stories instead." Outside, rain tapped steadily against the windows. "My dear," said Miss Marple softly, "I am very sorry." Cecily gave a small shrug. "It was a long time ago." "No," said Miss Marple gently, "not for you." For a moment the younger woman looked dangerously close to tears. Then she recovered herself. "You know the strange thing? If Leonard Pike had simply been cruel openly, people would have hated him." She laughed bitterly. "But respectable men commit their worst sins politely." Miss Marple said nothing because there was nothing useful to add. When Cecily rose to leave, she paused at the door. "You saved me." "No," said Miss Marple. "Truth did." After she departed, Miss Marple remained seated quietly beside the fire, holding the fragile teacup in her lap. A foolish object, really. Cheap porcelain, broken, ordinary. And yet somehow it had carried within it the entire hidden history of Rose Hill. Humiliation, loneliness, and finally violence. That evening Inspector Graves called once more before returning permanently to Medchester. "I owe you thanks," he admitted reluctantly. "My dear Inspector, policemen dislike owing elderly women thanks." "That's true." They shared a brief smile. Then Graves said more seriously, "I've been thinking about what you said." "Oh, dear." "That sounds dangerous. About overlooked people." Miss Marple looked at him kindly. "Yes?" He hesitated. "I think we all failed Mrs. Pike long before she became a murderer." The room fell quiet. At last Miss Marple nodded. "Yes," she said softly. "I believe that, too." After the inspector left, evening settled peacefully over the village. The church bells sounded faintly through damp autumn air. Somewhere nearby Florence hummed while washing dishes. Ordinary life resumed. It always did. Miss Marple sat beside the fire with the handleless teacup resting near her knitting basket. Then, after a long while, she sighed gently and returned to her knitting. Because even after murder, scandal, grief, and revelation, stockings still required mending, and villages like human hearts continued untidily onward. By late October, Rose Hill had regained the appearance of peace so completely that strangers passing through might never have guessed two people had died there only weeks before. The hedges burned gold and russet beneath pale skies. Smoke curled from cottage chimneys in the evenings. The women of the parish argued once more about flower arrangements and winter coal deliveries with reassuring seriousness. Only occasionally did silence fall too suddenly when certain names arose. Miss Marple understood that villages healed imperfectly. They did not forget tragedy, they absorbed it quietly into daily life, until it became another layer beneath the ordinary. On a cool Thursday afternoon she sat in her garden wrapped in a shawl, shelling peas into a bowl while sunlight drifted weakly across the lawn. Dr. Haydock appeared at the gate carrying a paper parcel. "Contraband," he announced. Miss Marple smiled. "Marmalade? From my sister in Devon. How criminal of you!" He settled into the chair opposite her with visible relief. "I've just come from Medchester." Miss Marple glanced up mildly. "And how is Mrs. Pike?" The doctor removed his gloves slowly. "Frailer? She's leaving Rose Hill." Miss Marple's hands paused among the peas. "Where will she go?" "A small seaside boarding-house near Eastbourne, apparently. Quiet place." Miss Marple nodded softly. "That is probably wise." There was a brief silence filled only by the rustle of autumn leaves. "And Gerald Foster?" she asked. Haydock sighed. "He's been formally charged with manslaughter rather than murder. Graves argued strongly for it." Miss Marple looked unsurprised. "Inspector Graves possesses more humanity than he likes admitting." The doctor gave a faint smile. "Gerald still insists everything was his fault." "Yes," said Miss Marple quietly. "Young men often confuse guilt with devotion." Haydock studied her for a moment. "You still think he loved Mrs. Pike?" Miss Marple considered carefully. "No," she said at last. "I think he loved the idea of rescuing someone." The doctor frowned thoughtfully. "And Mrs. Pike?" "She loved being seen." The answer surprised him. Miss Marple smiled gently. "My dear doctor, after years of invisibility, even kindness can feel dangerously like love." The autumn sun slipped briefly from behind clouds, touching the garden with pale brightness. "How extraordinary human beings are," Haydock murmured. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "That is precisely what makes them so troublesome. Later that afternoon, after the doctor departed, Miss Marple walked slowly into the village. Rose Hill looked charming in the golden light. Children chased hoops near the green. Mrs. Finch argued over cabbage prices outside the grocer's. The vicar bicycled past looking absent-minded and windswept. Life persisted stubbornly. Near the churchyard gate she encountered Cecily Harrow's motor-car standing beside the lane. A moment later Cecily herself emerged from the church carrying a small cluster of white chrysanthemums. "I thought you'd left already," said Miss Marple. "So did I." Cecily smiled faintly. "I came back for one last thing." "The grave?" Miss Marple looked toward the churchyard. "Leonard Pike's?" Cecily nodded. "How very surprising." "Not really." Cecily adjusted her gloves thoughtfully. "I spent years hating him. One grows tired eventually." Miss Marple regarded her quietly. "And now?" Cecily looked toward the autumn fields beyond the village. "I mostly feel sorry for everyone." A rook called harshly overhead. Then Cecily laughed softly. "You've infected me with wisdom, Miss Marple." "My dear, wisdom is usually only exhaustion with clearer language." For a while they stood together beneath drifting leaves. Then Cecily said unexpectedly, "You know what I keep thinking about?" "What?" "That ridiculous teacup." Miss Marple smiled. "Yes, all that destruction over something so small." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "No," she said gently. "Never the teacup itself." Cecily looked at her thoughtfully. "It was everything inside it. Humiliation, loneliness, secrets carried silently for years." The younger woman gave a slow nod. Then she reached forward unexpectedly and kissed Miss Marple lightly on the cheek. "Goodbye." "Goodbye, my dear." Miss Marple watched the motor-car disappear slowly down the lane toward Medchester and whatever future awaited Cecily Harrow beyond Rose Hill. Afterward she walked alone through the churchyard. The air smelled of damp earth and fallen leaves. Names weathered softly upon old stones. Entire lives reduced to brief inscriptions and dates. She paused beside Leonard Pike's grave. Fresh chrysanthemums rested there. Miss Marple stood silently for a moment. Then at last she sighed. "What foolish creatures we are," she murmured. "Not wicked always, not monstrous, simply foolish enough to wound one another repeatedly while pretending civility prevented cruelty." A faint wind stirred the trees overhead. At dusk Miss Marple returned home. Florence had lit the lamps already, and the cottage glowed warmly against the gathering cold. On the mantelpiece rested the handleless violet teacup beside her knitting basket. Broken, ordinary, still useful. Miss Marple touched it lightly as she passed. Then she settled into a chair, picked up her knitting, and allowed the peaceful sounds of evening to gather around her once more. Outside, Rose Hill prepared for winter. Inside, Miss Jane Marple continued quietly observing the world, understanding, perhaps better than anyone else, that evil rarely arrived wearing dramatic faces. More often it entered politely for tea. By December, frost silvered the roofs of Rose Hill each morning, and the village had entered that peculiar state of cheerful exhaustion which accompanied English Christmas preparations. The church committee argued over holly arrangements. Children rehearsed the nativity play with disastrous enthusiasm. Mrs. Greeley announced repeatedly that the parish pudding would fail entirely unless people stopped meddling with traditional recipes. Outwardly, Rose Hill seemed itself again. Yet Miss Marple noticed the quieter changes beneath the surface. People spoke more gently to one another. Not always. Of course, villages would cease functioning entirely without small quarrels, but the recent tragedies lingered like an unwelcome lesson everyone preferred not to mention directly. Leonard Pike's house stood empty now. Its shuttered windows overlooked the green with an oddly accusing stillness. Prospective buyers had already viewed it twice, though villagers complained privately that one could never feel comfortable there after everything. Miss Marple suspected someone eventually would. Human beings adjusted remarkably quickly to houses where terrible things had happened, provided the rent proved reasonable. One bitter afternoon a week before Christmas, Miss Marple sat with Dolly Bantry beside the fire at the cottage. Dolly had finally arrived from St. Mary Mead, armed with curiosity, expensive chocolates, and opinions. "My dear Jane," she declared, removing her gloves dramatically, "you neglected to mention half the interesting parts." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "One cannot put murders properly into letters. They sound melodramatic." Dolly accepted tea eagerly. "Well, I think the whole thing frightfully sad. But honestly, that poor Mrs. Pike. 30 years married to a creature like Leonard Pike." Dolly shuddered. "I should have poisoned him myself." "Dolly." Well, perhaps not literally. Miss Marple resumed knitting. Most people imagine murder requires monstrous feelings. Usually it merely requires feelings left alone too long. Dolly considered this soberly. You really think she never meant to become that sort of woman? My dear, said Miss Marple gently, almost no one does. Outside snow began falling softly across the village green. Dolly watched it for a moment before speaking again. And the boy? Gerald Foster? He will serve a short sentence most likely. How dreadful. Dolly stirred her tea thoughtfully. You know what troubles me most? Everyone in Rosehill seems determined to remember Leonard Pike as respectable despite everything. Miss Marple looked unsurprised. People are more comfortable with respectable sins than obvious unhappiness. Dolly snorted. That's very true. There was a pause. Then Dolly lowered her voice. And Cecily Harrow? She writes occasionally. How is she? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Lonelier than she pretends. That's practically a village disease. Yes, said Miss Marple softly. I believe it is. That evening the church held its annual Christmas concert. The hall glowed with candlelight and evergreen branches. Children recited poetry with alarming confidence, while elderly ladies distributed mince pies under Mrs. Greeley's strict supervision. Miss Marple attended wrapped in a warm grey shawl. As she sat listening to a painfully earnest violin solo, she reflected how strange it was that ordinary life resumed so naturally after catastrophe. Only months earlier this same hall had contained terror, poison, death. Now villagers applauded badly performed carols and worried about burnt sausage rolls. Perhaps, Miss Marple thought, that was humanity's greatest strength, or greatest foolishness. During the interval, Inspector Graves appeared unexpectedly beside her chair. Back from Medchester. My dear Inspector, said Miss Marple pleasantly. How festive. He smiled reluctantly. I was passing through. Naturally. They moved toward a quieter corner near the coat stand. How is Gerald Foster? She asked softly. Graves hesitated. He asked after Mrs. Pike. Miss Marple nodded sadly. And her? She's gone to Eastbourne exactly as Haydock said? Keeps mostly to herself. The inspector looked thoughtful. You know, I still think about that case. Oh, dear. No, seriously. He frowned slightly. It bothers me how close we came to hanging the wrong person. Miss Marple regarded him kindly. My dear Inspector, certainty is very dangerous in murder cases, particularly when villages provide convenient villains. Graves glanced across the crowded hall. People judged Cecily Harrow long before Leonard Pike died, and ignored Mrs. Pike long before she poisoned him. Exactly. The choir began assembling again near the piano. Then Inspector Graves said quietly, You once told me overlooked people are the most dangerous. Miss Marple smiled gently. Merely the most important to notice. For a moment neither spoke. Then Graves laughed softly. You know, you make everything sound simple afterward. My dear Inspector, truth always appears simple once one knows it. The Christmas concert ended with enthusiastic but uncertain singing of God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen. Snow still fell beyond the windows, covering Rosehill in soft white silence. Villagers departed bundled in scarves and mufflers, calling cheerful good nights through clouds of frosted breath. Miss Marple walked home slowly beneath the falling snow. The village looked peaceful again, almost innocent. But she knew better, of course. Every village contained hidden griefs, buried humiliations, quiet cruelties, secret loves. Civilization merely taught people how to disguise them politely. Back inside her cottage, Florence had left mulled wine warming near the fire. The handleless violet teacup still rested on the mantelpiece. Miss Marple picked it up carefully. Strange, she thought, how such a small broken thing had carried so much human sorrow within it. Then she smiled faintly to herself. Outside, Christmas bells rang softly through the snow-covered dark. And inside the little cottage, Miss Jane Marple settled once more beside the fire, knitting needles clicking gently, while winter gathered peacefully around Rosehill. Winter settled fully over Rosehill after Christmas. The fields hardened silver beneath morning frost. Smoke drifted steadily from cottage chimneys, and the village moved into its familiar cold-weather habits. Early darkness, long conversations beside fires, and endless discussion regarding dampness, influenza, and the price of coal. By January, the murders had already begun transforming into a story. Not truth villagers seldom preserved truth accurately, but story. Miss Marple heard versions constantly. At the butcher's, Leonard Pike became either a tyrant or a saint, depending upon who spoke. At the Blue Boar, Gerald Foster was alternately described as tragic, weak, romantic, or wicked. Mrs. Pike herself had faded into something vaguer. That poor woman. People preferred simplification. Complexity made them uncomfortable. One sharp afternoon, Miss Marple received a letter bearing Eastbourne postmarks. The handwriting trembled slightly. "Dear Miss Marple, Dr. Haydock said perhaps writing to you would ease my mind. I do not know whether anything can ease it now, but I find myself wishing to speak honestly to someone for once." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and continued reading slowly beside the fire. "I often think you understood me better than I understood myself. That is a strange feeling after so many years of not being understood at all." A long pause followed before the next lines. "I did not mean to kill Leonard when I first carried the poison. I know that sounds absurd now, but I think perhaps many dreadful things begin without full intention." Miss Marple sighed softly. That was true. He laughed at me that afternoon, not cruelly, even almost casually, and suddenly I knew he would continue forever. The affairs, the humiliations, the corrections, all of it. The fire crackled quietly. What frightened me afterward was not the murder itself, but the relief. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. That, too, was terribly human. The letter continued. "Gerald should never have tried to save me. He mistook my unhappiness for goodness. I think lonely people often make that mistake." At the end came a final line. "Please keep the teacup. Somehow I feel it belongs with you now." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and placed it beside her knitting basket. Outside, snow began falling once more. Later that evening, Dolly Bantry telephoned from St. Mary Mead full of outrage about a bridge club disagreement involving the most dishonest scorekeeping imaginable. Miss Marple listened patiently. "My dear Jane, are you even paying attention?" "Perfectly. You sound miles away." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I was thinking about murder." "Well, honestly," said Dolly, "that's even less cheerful than bridge." After the call ended, Miss Marple remained seated quietly for some time. She thought of Mrs. Pike alone in Eastbourne, of Gerald Foster growing older behind prison walls, of Edith Bell who had wanted truth too late, and of Leonard Pike himself, not a monster perhaps, but something nearly as dangerous. A man who believed power excused cruelty so long as it remained respectable. The next morning Inspector Graves arrived unexpectedly during heavy snowfall. "I was nearby," he explained unconvincingly. "Inspectors are always nearby when tea is available," said Miss Marple. He accepted this with dignity. During tea he glanced toward the violet teacup resting on the mantelpiece. "You kept it." "Yes." "Why?" "Yes." "Why?" Miss Marple considered. "Because objects remember people differently than villages do." Graves frowned slightly. "I'm not sure what that means." "My dear Inspector, villages turn human beings into simplified stories. Villains." She looked toward the cup. "But objects quietly preserve the ordinary truth." He followed her gaze. "A broken cup." The inspector stirred his tea thoughtfully. "You know, when I first came to Rose Hill I thought this was a straightforward poisoning." Miss Marple laughed softly. "Murder never is." "No." He shook his head. "It turned out to be about years of unhappiness instead." Silence settled comfortably between them. Then Graves asked unexpectedly, "Do you ever get tired of seeing the worst in people?" Miss Marple looked genuinely surprised. "My dear Inspector, I don't see the worst." "No?" "No." She smiled gently. "I see the whole of them." Outside, snow drifted steadily across the village green, where children now shouted happily while building crooked snowmen. Life continuing again. Always continuing. Inspector Graves rose eventually to leave. At the door he paused. "There's one thing I still don't understand." "Yes?" "Why Edith Bell frightened everyone so much." Miss Marple's expression softened sadly. "Because she represented truth arriving too late." The inspector stood silent a moment. Then he nodded slowly and departed into the falling snow. That evening Rose Hill disappeared beneath white winter silence. Miss Marple sat alone beside the fire, knitting folded neatly in her lap. The handleless teacup rested nearby, catching warm light along its faded painted violets. Broken. Imperfect. Still enduring. At length she reached for it gently and poured herself the last of the evening tea. Outside, the snow continued falling softly over Rose Hill, covering roads, rooftops, graves, and gardens alike with the same quiet mercy. February arrived slowly in Rose Hill, bringing damp mornings, bare hedges, and the weary feeling that winter had overstayed its welcome. The village moved quietly now. The excitement surrounding the murders had faded into habit, and habit into silence. Only strangers still asked questions. The newspaper men had long since disappeared. The parish hall had reopened for committee meetings and jumble sales. Mrs. Greeley once again devoted herself entirely to church matters with the determined energy of a woman grateful for ordinary problems. And yet beneath everything Rose Hill had changed. Miss Marple noticed it in small things. People spoke more kindly to timid women. Young maids were treated with slightly greater patience. Men interrupted less often during committee discussions, though not, Miss Marple admitted privately, nearly enough. Tragedy had embarrassed the village into brief humanity. One pale afternoon Miss Marple received another visitor. To her surprise it was Colonel Avery. He removed his gloves awkwardly after Florence showed him into the parlor. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all." The colonel remained standing for a moment before finally sitting down heavily. "I wanted to say something." Miss Marple waited politely. "I judged Cecily Harrow unfairly." "Yes," said Miss Marple gently. "You did." He winced slightly at the calm honesty. "I've been thinking about it ever since." Miss Marple poured tea quietly. "Villages remember women's mistakes far longer than men's." The colonel stared into the fire. "Leonard Pike spread stories about her years ago, and I believed them." Miss Marple handed him his tea. "Most people did." He gave a tired sigh. "You know what's damned uncomfortable? Realizing one helped create the conditions for all this." Miss Marple looked at him thoughtfully. "That is uncomfortable." The colonel managed a bleak smile. "You never let people escape responsibility politely, do you?" "My dear Colonel, polite escapes are usually what create tragedies." For a long moment neither spoke. Then Avery said quietly, "I visited Mrs. Pike before Christmas." Miss Marple looked up. "How is she?" "Small," he said after a pause. "That's the only word for it. She seemed diminished." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "She asked me something strange before I left." "What was that?" The colonel hesitated. "She asked whether people were happier after truth came out." Silence settled gently through the room. "And what did you tell her?" Miss Marple asked. "That I didn't know." Miss Marple nodded faintly. "That was probably wise." After he departed, the cottage felt unusually quiet. Miss Marple sat beside the fire thinking about Mrs. Pike's question. Were people happier after truth? Not always. Truth rarely repaired damage completely. It simply ended pretending. Toward evening, Florence entered carrying the post. "There's another letter for you, miss." The envelope bore Gerald Foster's handwriting. Miss Marple opened it slowly. "Dear Miss Marple, the prison chaplain says writing honestly may help me understand things better. I am not certain I deserve understanding, but perhaps I owe truth to someone at last." She continued reading carefully. "I loved Mrs. Pike because she looked at people gently. That sounds childish written down, but it mattered to me. Most people in Rose Hill judged constantly. She never did." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. "Poor boy. I think now I confuse kindness with salvation. When Edith Bell argued with her near the quarry, I saw missize. Pike began crying, and suddenly all I could think was that someone was hurting the only person who had ever truly pitied me." The handwriting became shakier toward the bottom. "People speak about murder as though it arrives in one clear moment. But it felt more like falling downstairs in darkness. By the time I understood what I'd done, it already existed forever." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully into her lap. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows once more. Rose Hill returning slowly toward spring. Returning toward ordinary life, and yet nothing ever returned entirely unchanged. That evening Miss Marple attended choir practice at the church hall. The sopranos sang flatly. Mrs. Finch argued over hymn selections. The vicar lost his spectacles twice. Everything felt comfortingly absurd. As she sat listening to the choir stumble bravely through Abide With Me, Miss Marple looked around the hall thoughtfully. Here, months earlier, Leonard Pike had died among teacups and gossip and ordinary village chatter. And now life had reclaimed the space entirely. That, perhaps, was civilization's strangest habit, its determination to continue. After practice, Mrs. Greeley approached her importantly. "We're considering replacing the parish tea service." Miss Marple blinked. "Really?" People remained nervous about the old cups. "How understandable." Mrs. Greeley lowered her voice. "Though between ourselves, I always thought those violet ones looked rather shabby." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes," she said softly. People often underestimate shabby things. Later that night, back in her cottage, Miss Marple sat alone beside the fire one final time with the handleless teacup resting near her knitting basket. The painted violets had faded slightly with age. A crack ran delicately down one side. Broken, overlooked, still useful. Very much like certain people she had known. Miss Marple poured tea carefully into the cup and watched steam rise gently into the warm lamplight. Then, with a small, thoughtful smile, she returned to her knitting while Rosehill slept quietly beneath the rain. And, somewhere beyond the village, hidden beneath all the ordinary sounds of England continuing onward, the echoes of truth finally faded into silence.